The Empress returns by Iowa forever. Chapter 3.04, Testing and Research. I understand that the Empress works in mysterious ways, Ruth muttered. But what in the name of sanity possessed her to make Judith a saint? Matthias watched as Ruth buried her head in her hands, not even looking up as the sister in question sauntered up to her. "Aw, don't feel so down, Ruth," she chirped, grinning as she hefted her now gold-plated heavy flamer. "I'm sure the Empress had a good reason, and she made Frederick so pretty. Look, he's even got a little blue skull." She pointed to the sapphire skull and crossbones on the flamer's fuel tank, the gem sparking as she pointed to it. Ruth just gave another groan. "Perhaps it is punishment for some sin I have committed." Matthias was not a priest, but he was certain that was not how the Empress worked. He would have said something before he felt a light tap on his shoulder. "Matthias, can I talk to you for a moment?" Twilight asked. From her wet hair and hurriedly prepared robes Matthias guessed she had recently showered, but he pushed comments on her appearance out of mind as he followed her to a more secluded part of the hangar. Behind him, he could hear Judith singing something about her new sainthood, but that too he deemed irrelevant. "I see you are taking this development in stride," he said once he was certain they were out of earshot. "I'm doing what I can," Twilight said, reaching into her robe and pulling out a notebook. "After I came down from whatever energy Judith was giving off after she gained the element of laughter, I almost just crawled back into my room to wait everything out." She paused before shaking her head. "But no, that's not what I needed. I got a notebook and started jotting down a couple theories about what we're seeing here. It's probably the only thing keeping me from relapsing right now." Twilight passed the notebook to him, Matthias taking a moment to thumb through the notes. Most of it was in the looping hieroglyphs Twilight liked to write in, but there was enough Gothic peppered within that he understood what she was speaking of. To a point. Psycho-emotional singularity? Paralleling summoning? Matthias frowned. "I don't wish to sound rude, Twilight, but this makes no sense." "I know," Twilight cried. "I said the same thing as I was writing it down." She stopped, taking a moment to compose herself before continuing. "Back home, the elements of harmony manifested all at once when my friends and I used them to purify Luna, and only after a long trip through a variety of dangers and trials. How is that any different than what we've been through? You may notice we only have 2 elements, not 6. Twilight pointed back to the sisters, Matthias following her finger as his gaze fell upon Judith. "Hey, look what I can do." She brought her heavy flamer around, a brief pause hanging in the air before a torrent of pink and white flames roared from the weapon. Pink and white. "Oh Frederick, you're so strong now. Please, keep talking before I start worrying about her setting my ship on fire." Matthias turned back to Twilight. "So these elements are not all manifesting at once." "Right, so I can't just rely on my current knowledge of them to help us going forward." Twilight took her notebook back and thumbed through a few pages. "So I started looking for parallels, anything that might be used to paint a bigger picture and help us in the future, and I think I've got a basic theory forming. Now, the warp in this universe is more easily affected by strong emotions, probably from the constant abuse of chaos and rogue psychers and the like. That in turn means that when a strong enough emotion is displayed, it fundamentally changes the makeup of the warp and how it interacts with the material world." "But the sisters aren't psychers," Matthias pointed out. "Yes, but 4 of my friends back home aren't unicorns and can't use magic like I can. Still, only psychers can have a lasting impact on the makeup of the warp. The very nature of the place makes it more receptive to those that can push and pull against it, if my research into Angelique's condition is anything to go by. Anyone else wouldn't have been able to affect the warp in the manner you described. Normally I'd agree with you, but the elements here and back in Equestria don't act like normal warpcraft." Twilight turned a page before continuing. "See, normally to cast a spell I need to think of what I want to do, cast my soul into the Imperium, and use the right combination of force and emotion to draw that power back to me and project it into reality. From what I've gathered from Rebecca, the elements skip the soul casting and drawing back and go right to the result. So if they break the laws of magic in this universe that way, it stands to reason that someone without magic of any kind would be able to summon an element if they had an extreme showing of that particular virtue. Rebecca gained the element of kindness when she healed Bianca on Rin's world. Healing is sometimes considered one of the ultimate forms of kindness, since you are going above and beyond to alleviate someone's suffering in a time of need. Thus, a strong emotion in a desperate situation leads to a sister healing her friend and gaining the element. And Judith? Judith's a little trickier since we're talking about laughter, which is more of an action than a virtue like loyalty or kindness." She paused, blinking a few times before reaching into her robe to pull out a pencil. "Probably research into broader definitions of the elements anyway. Judith helped me start to make peace with Meerschaen's death, and got me to laugh and feel joy once more. Her persistence and desire to see me happy must have been enough to trigger the manifestation of laughter, which adds another wrinkle considering the element of kindness came from nothing, but laughter merely enhanced Frederick. At this point I assume it was different in your universe, so I won't even ask, Matthias sighed. So, what do we do with all this? Well, Twilight gave a sheepish grin, massaging the back of her head with a free hand. See, so much of my notes are fragments, more or less, so that's why I called you and the sisters down here. Why? I want 5 days, at least, to run a slew of tests on the sisters to learn more about what's going on here and how best to get the elements to manifest. Matthias blinked, his right hand tightening a moment before he spoke. Twilight, we don't have the resources for a full study on these elements, he began. But we can't risk missing the elements manifesting if we don't, Twilight countered, snapping her notes shut. All I need is one terminal and maybe one of Angelique's psychic dampeners, that's all. We'll stay up here out of your way while you and the others finish repairing the ship, and I promise I won't break anything. While I'm sure you won't intentionally do anything to harm the ship, there's still too many variables at stake here. My grasp of the nature of warpcraft is already limited compared to yours, but you just told me that these things break that nature even further. What if your experiments end up causing further damage, either to you or the sisters? The elements aren't that dangerous, Twilight mumbled. I gathered, just Matthias sighed, bringing his hand to his forehead as he mulled over what next to say. Circumstances are dire enough, and stepping too far into the unknown might pull us down further. Benevolent or not, it's just not something I can risk right now. Matthias, I know the elements won't harm us, Twilight reached out, resting a hand on Matthias' shoulder. And for the first time since, well, I don't know, probably before everything went wrong on Rin's world, I finally feel a sense of peace again. That the elements are manifesting fully tells me we will win these wars and save the Imperium, and that's something I can't give up. Her smile fell, but only just. Meerschaum would not want me to lose hope so quickly. Matthias said nothing, looking at Twilight as she looked hopefully back up at him. In any other situation he could easily have said no, put her back on focus for getting help and then, perhaps, indulging in her quest for knowledge. But then Twilight was still recovering, and any small glimmer of hope right now would be. Hope is the first step on the path to disappointment, but that has never slowed Twilight. Limited tests, he said finally. Only 4 hours a day, nothing too onerous or invasive, and I want to be able to observe your experiments myself. I can work with that, Twilight replied, her smile returning fully. Thank you, Matthias. You really don't know what this means to me. If it helps you and the Imperium, I can venture a guess. Twilight nodded, moving past Matthias as she approached the sisters. The sisters quickly gathered around her as she began to explain whatever experiments she had planned out, and all Matthias could do was quietly chuckle. Twilight still had a way to go. But, at least, she appeared to be getting better. Atop his tower on the planet of sorcerers, Magnus the Red brooded. He had taken a form closer to his old human shape, slouching on his throne as he gazed forward. Any guards or minions who would have normally waited on him had been dismissed, leaving the Primarch alone in his thoughts. Off to the side a number of experiments and half-written treatises lay unsecured, their dark knowledge neglected as Magnus turned his thoughts to other matters. Specifically, to the small violet flame suspended in a pentagram in the center of his floor. Warp flame was more resilient than normal flames, but this one had far outlasted even the greatest fires Magnus had seen burning through the Imperium. If anything, it had traced him through the warp and reappeared after the Battle of Solemnus, as if it were trying to torment him with its continued existence. Time and again he had tried to dismiss it, and when that had failed Magnus sought to contain it, the light taking the form it now held once the pentagram had been completed. And Magnus could only brood. So, you seek to torment me further, he grumbled, staring at the flame as it continued to dance. Why? What gain do you have from doing this? What is it about this magic, about its caster, that makes it so special? The flame would not answer him, twisting about within the constraints of the pentagram as he continued to watch. A more prudent sorcerer would have moved on, set the matter aside for something more likely to yield answers. Chaos was never one for prudence. Magnus would have continued brooding were it not for a disturbance within the warp. A presence drew closer to him, shadows collection from the corners of the room to take shape before him. Magnus had shifted the pentagram out of sight, taking the flame with it, so only he appeared present when the image of Lorgar manifested. Magnus, Lorgar said, giving Magnus a thin smile. I see you have returned from Solemnus. Such as it is, Magnus replied, still not moving from his slump. Why so forlorn, brother? Lorgar asked. Have you tired as well of Alfarius games? I have heard rumors he staged a second attack on Kamara instead of giving me the anathema. Lorger's image flared at this, Magnus saying nothing as he studied his brother's displeasure. So Lorger truly desires that sword part of his dark god's plan, perhaps? It matters not, Lorger continued, calming down as his smile returned. As it stands, I have a mission for you, and oh, how shall I put it, a nice gift for you. Forgive me if I grow weary of gifts, Magnus said, his eye briefly drifting to where he was using Lorger's treatises as a doorstop. Ah, but this one I think you will like. The image of Lorger faded, replaced instead by a frozen planet Magnus knew well. Fenris. Leman Russ has returned from the Eye of Terror, nipping at our heels like the dog he is. He will no doubt link up with the Loyalists in the south, and perhaps provide a stalling point for our advance against the Imperium. Brother, your hatred against the wolves is strong, stronger than any other slight against you. What better way to heal this wrong by striking down the wolf on his own land? Magnus said nothing as Lorger returned. Mortarion is amassing a fleet to strike Fenris and draw Russ away from Agrippina, where the Loyalists make their stand. You will join him, and I give you free rein to do whatever you please with Fenris and its citizens, Lorger chuckled. I can already think of a few uses for some of the rabble's spare parts. Magnus shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing more. Lorger blinked at this. Did you just say He sputtered, his spectre drawing closer to Magnus. Brother, I am giving you a chance to extract your vengeance against the wolves and Russ, and all you can say is As shocking as it may seem to you, there are other matters that interest me more at this time. Magnus rose, returning to his demon form to tower over the spectre. I am the master of the Thousand Suns and lord of the Imperium. I can enact vengeance on the wolves whenever and wherever I please. But now I have a chance for a far greater prize than even Russ had. Really? Lorger crossed his arms. For 15,000 years you have plotted vengeance for Prospero. It has been your obsession, the driving force behind all you have done since you learned the truth of chaos. What could be so important that you would turn away from that at a moment's notice? The girl from Rin's world was on Solemnus, and I have stolen some of her magic. Lorger's expression dropped, the spectre drawing away as Magnus gave a smile of his own. Do I have your attention now, brother? Did you kill her? Lorger asked. No. By some quirk of fate or the nature of her powers she escaped before I could land a final blow. Magnus shifted his hand, bringing the flame back to the center of the room to show Lorger. But this spark remained, and I intend to study it so I might learn more about our enemy and what sorcery she uses. It would be better if you captured the little witch instead of merely toying with some paltry flames. Lorger scoffed. I wish to see her suffer for all she has done in defying me. That is something you will never understand about the warp, Lorger. Not everything can be solved with mere brute force, as easy as it may seem at times. This flame does not act like any warp flame I have seen, and it appears to have some control over itself. Were I to just ignore it, we would miss a wonderful opportunity to turn this power for our own use, perhaps strike the Emperor with power she thought was only hers to control. Lorger fell silent, Magnus waiting for his eventual agreement. As lofty as he could be sometimes, the other Primarch appeared to be far more short-sighted these days. Perhaps following the Dark God so closely has rotted his mind. Fine, Lorger said. Take whatever time you need. Just know that the attack on Fenris will still go as planned, with or without you. Magnus' hands tightened, but Lorger did not draw further attention to this as he began to fade from view. I look forward to your discoveries, Magnus. And if you find that girl again, bring her to me alive. If possible, Magnus said, the last of the apparitions snuffing out before Lorger could get another word in. Magnus waited a minute, in case Lorger returned to blather on about some other matter, but when he was certain he would not be disturbed, he turned his attention to the flame. He shifted his powers, tracing out a rhino-sized portion of the floor before raising his hand. With a rumble of grinding stone, the section rose up, shifting until a large table had formed. That task complete, Magnus reached out and pulled a blank tome from another table, the book coming to a rest near the flame as Magnus conjured a pen. Mark now, my findings on this spark created by the student of the Emperor of Mankind, he said, the pen etching his words onto the paper as he directed all his focus on the flame. For now it has taken the form of a small violet flame, perhaps half a meter in diameter, and Magnus reached out with his powers, magic twisting around and probing at the flame. And it appears to burn of its own accord. There is no underlying weave, no incantation or singularity that holds it to where it stands, it just is. Magnus furrowed his brow. Perhaps Lorger's methods might be applicable here. Magnus focused, shifting forms once more as he reached out to the flame. It shrank from his reach at first, but soon the flame returned to its normal dance as Magnus lightly brushed his hand against it. There was a hiss before Magnus jerked his hand back, pain flashing through his arm as he looked down at his palm. He had barely touched the flame, and yet it had left a sizable burn across his hand, white scar tissue clashing with red flesh. Even shifting back into his demon form did not dismiss the scar, the wound throbbing as he tried and failed to apply magic to heal it. Strange, he mused, his pen continuing to etch out his thoughts. It did not do that when the girl first struck me. Perhaps its nature has changed? I will need some test subjects. This thing is heavy, Rebecca said, rolling her head to try and make the rewired psychic dampener fit properly. Are you sure this is necessary, Tara? Oh, absolutely, Tara said, stepping up to jam a cable into one socket on the dampener. See, if the elements are acting like normal psychic powers, which they aren't, but you always need a control, then when you use the element of kindness it should show heightened brain activity as the psychic powers work through your mind and out into the warp. But since it isn't and you aren't a psyker to begin with, it should show up as blank when you use the element. Rebecca worked her jaw as she tried and failed to come up with a good counter to this. Maybe Judith's ascension to sainthood did something to her mind. Anyway, you just stand there and do your thing, and I'll be over at the terminal keeping an eye on things. Tara hurried back to her terminal, shooing Lord Matthias out of the way before flipping a few switches and looking up at Rebecca. Okay, whenever you're ready. Tara, I've never used the element of kindness when there's no one that is injured, Rebecca started, massaging the narthecium as she continued. I don't know if your experiment is going to work. Just do what you normally do when someone's injured. Tara gave her a smile. Go on, it can't be that hard, Rebecca said nothing, looking back down at the element of kindness while the dampener shifted on her head. Tara's methods were well, Judith made a little more sense. But if it helps her recover from Meerschaum, she thought I should do all that I can. She closed her eyes, bringing the narthecium up to her chest as she reached back through her memories. She thought of Rin's world, of healing Bianca and helping those bearing the brunt of the Tyranid attack. She closed her hand and furrowed her brow, the metal from the dampener pressing into her scalp as she tried to conjure something, anything that would help Tara in her quest for understanding? That didn't seem like the right word. Is anything happening? She asked, opening one eye to peer out at the others. Tara was too focused on her terminal, scribbling on a notepad as her eyes flicked back and forth. No, Tara said, looking back up at Rebecca with a grin. Just like I predicted. If it were actual psychic powers I would have seen something, but... Tara, nothing actually happened, Matthias interrupted. You've seen what the healing process for the element looks like, there's usually some kind of glow around the element when it's in use. Tara's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl as she looked back at the screen. Rebecca wanted to inch closer and perhaps get an idea of what it was Tara was seeing, but instinct and the dampener told her to stay put. Besides, what business do I have looking into research? Can't believe I forgot about that, Tara grumbled. Okay, so it doesn't work on its own, or if it does Rebecca's not giving it the right psychic inputs. I need a volunteer. Two Zongers entered Magnus' study, the bird-like mutants dragging a shackled slave between them. Magnus loomed over them, waving his hand to produce a small bowl before the group as they came to a stop. This ritual calls for blood, he said. Be fortunate that you have been selected to help complete my great work. The prisoner was twisted around, one Zaanger pulling a jagged knife from a pouch on its belt before reaching towards the prisoner's throat. No, not that much blood, Magnus said quickly, drawing the Zonger's attention back to him. I only need a small amount. Perhaps the hand will be more useful. The Zonger stood there for a moment, looking up to their master with confusion. Finally the one with the knife seemed to get the idea, yanking the prisoner's hand over the bowl before quickly slicing the knife across the palm. A small trickle of blood pooled within the bowl, Magnus drawing it back up as he turned back to his workplace and the bench. The flame is not of chaos, but its reactions with the powers of the warp must be documented, he said, etching out a small summoning circle with a claw as he continued. A lesser demon will be adequate for such an experiment. The summoning circle complete, Magnus poured the contents of the bowl into the grooves, blood flowing down the etched stone. The blood shifted until it was a bright pink, light filling the space around the pentagram as a being began to take shape. The creature was typical of most horrors of Seanch, a head with a beaked mouth and several gangly arms and legs. The demon chortled as it bounced away from the summoning circle, small bits of warp flame training after it as it searched for a victim, for purpose. Magnus twisted his hand to bring the student's flame back towards the center of the table, catching the horror's eye as it drew closer. Demons react negatively to most forms of order, so perhaps this one may attack the flame. Let's see how it counters. Magnus watched as the horror circled the flame, gibbering away in the twisted language of demons as it studied this new power. The flame did nothing, just continued its dance as the demon circled, Magnus jotting down a few notes as he continued his observation. Finally the horror hissed, jumping away and flinging a few bolts of warp flame at the spark, all of which missed or fizzled out when striking it. Interesting, Magnus mused. But I was hoping for a more direct result. Before the horror could react, Magnus seized it with his magic and tossed it into the flame. The demon shrieked in surprise and fear as it hurtled towards the fire. As soon as the horror touched the flame, it sprung up to consume the demon like a predator attacking an unsuspecting victim. The demon let out another shriek as violet flames wrapped around its body, its arms flailing as it dissolved into the fire. Finally the room fell silent, Magnus standing alone as he reached out into the warp for any sign of the demon. He found none. Not even the slightest residue that the horror had ever been there. It was as if the flame had completely and utterly erased it from existence. Most interesting, he mused. With it being anathema to chaotic power, handling directly may cause further injury. I will need more information on its base nature before I can proceed further. He turned to where the two Zongers were waiting. Bring me more slaves. Are you sure you want to do this? Terra asked, watching as Veronica pulled her combat knife free from her belt and examined it. Terra, we have all seen how this element works, and the simple thing is that there are no more injured personnel aboard this ship between my sister's healing and Bianca's labors. Veronica turned her attention back to her hand. One of us has to make a sacrifice, and I am more than happy to do so. But my idea would have worked just fine, Terra protested, drawing a few glances from the assembled sisters. Terra, fake bandages and a sob story about a tyrant attack are not going to fool an artifact as powerful as you've described these elements, Naomi said, her voice flat. I thought it would be fine, Terra mumbled, drawing away and tucking her hands against her stomach. Veronica's gaze softened, and she drew her knife back before turning to face Terra. I know you do not wish to see any more of us injured on our journeys, she said, keeping her voice soft. Have faith, Terra, in us and the powers you hold dear, and none of us will come to lasting harm. Terra wrung her hands, but soon she gave a small nod and wandered back to her workstation. She said something to Matthias Veronica could not hear before turning back to the group. Okay, we're going to perform a live test with an injured subject, she started. As much as I hate it, we have no other uninjured personnel, so Sister Veronica has volunteered to be our subject. Veronica, whenever you're ready. Veronica nodded, turning back to her hand as she shifted the knife in her hand. She took a short breath before slicing downward, a trickle of blood flowing from the wound and down her arm. Rebecca quickly took Veronica's hand in her own, closing her eyes as she tightened her grip and a soft glow enveloped the two. Veronica felt a shift, a soothing presence flowing from her sister's hand and through her arm. The pain in her hand subsided, and she could feel her skin and flesh gently knitting itself back together. Finally the glowing stopped, Rebecca drawing back as Veronica inspected her hand, now completely uninjured. Did that work, Terra? Veronica asked, the sisters drawing back to Terra's terminal as she continued to jot down her notes. She paused, drumming her pencil against her chin as her eyes darted back and forth between her notes and the screen. This she finally said, her brow furrowing. This is good, very good. Frustrating, but still good. She made a few more notes before continuing. There was definitely some kind of energy flowing through Rebecca when she used the element, not warp energy, but we've already established that. So what does that mean for all of us? Another pause. I think that's enough for tonight. Terra snapped her book shut before turning to the sisters. I'll go over these notes and prepare some tests for Judith tomorrow. When I've got everything down, then I can present my findings and we will know what we are dealing with here. Will you be needing us for anything more? Ruth asked. Terra's hand tightened, her eyes darting between the sisters and Matthias. Finally, she allowed a small smile. Well, I will be needing some help getting my notes together. Her smile grew wider. I would love your help. 9 groups of 9 slaves had been assembled on 9 points of Magnus' summoning circle, Zongers forcing the humans to their knees as they were chained in place. Magnus waited, allowing his power to flow through the carving and around the slaves as he prepared the ritual. Once the slaves were in place, the Zongers withdrew to the edge for the room, allowing Magnus to step from the shadows. I call upon the powers of the warp, for I am its lord and master, he said, raising his blade as the circle began to glow. The slaves tried to squirm free, but the Zongers did their work well and not a single one could escape their chains. Come to me, masters of magic. Come to me and reveal those secrets you have denied me. I am Magnus, Lord of the Thousand Suns, and by my command you shall rise. With that he slammed the hilt of his halberd into the center of the circle, blue tendrils snapping upward and wrapping around the slaves. The prisoners screamed, trying and failing to break free as Magnus ripped their souls to shreds and sent them to oblivion. He pulled against the Imperium, tearing reality asunder as he drew forth a being who could help him with his research. There was a flash, shadows filling the room as Magnus stepped back. A shape began to materialize from the shadows, a hunched figure shifting about to face the Primarch. Its forearms drew comparison to the horrors, but it possessed the body of a man and the legs of a bird. Half of its face was normal, a thin-cheeked humanoid with 4 eyes and small horns, but the rest was not but a swirling mass of warp energy. It drew its hand forward to materialize a silver stave before turning to face Magnus, floating on some dark energy as it probed the edge of the summoning circle. "You are the demon called the Archivist," Magnus said. "I have need of your knowledge." "Magnus," the creature hissed. "I am surprised it has taken you this long to summon me for my secrets. I had no need for questions on more trivial matters, things that one such as you would not bother to consider." Magnus drew his hand forward, summoning the spark as he continued. "But you are said to be unmatched in the knowledge of the most twisted and obscure powers of the warp. Perhaps this might be within your purview." Perhaps the Archivist drifted, its humanoid face shifting into the semblance of a frown as it inspected the flame. "Where did you find this?" "A girl marches beneath the shadow of the anathema. She cast this spell on the dead world of Solemnus before escaping my grasp." Magnus' injured hand tightened. "Its energies are unknown to me, save that they counteract the powers of chaos in every way imaginable and will destroy all that have spawned from it if allowed direct contact." "And so you summon me to try and save your own hide," the demon said, drifting back from the circle to put distance between the flame and itself. "I have heard of such powers before. In the closing days of the war in heaven, the Old Ones tampered with similar powers to try and create mighty weapons to use against the star gods and our own fledgling kind. Obviously, they failed." "She channels the powers of the Old Ones?" "I cannot say for certain. I will need time to research." The Archivist spread its hands, 6 tomes and a number of scrolls materializing before it as the demon turned once more to face the flame. Magnus watched as the creature sped through the tomes at a pace the greatest of men could barely track, arcane power swirling around the Archivist as it pulled from countless eons of knowledge to try and understand the truth of the flame. Several times it reached for the flame, probing it with its magic long enough to draw some energy forth but not long enough to be harmed by it. As the demon did its work, Magnus mulled over the possibilities. A power similar to the Old Ones could be devastating against the Imperium, just as much as it could wreak havoc upon the forces of Magnus and his brothers. Though perhaps I might be able to bend this power further without alerting Lorgar, of course. Frustrating, most frustrating, Magnus snapped back to the present as the Archivist dismissed its tomes. "There is nothing among the knowledge of the Old Ones that matches this energy signature, not enough to draw a direct comparison." "I see," Magnus said, his frustration flaring for the briefest of moments before he continued. "Perhaps in their failings one of their successors might have investigated further?" "If they did, I would have told you that," the Archivist countered. "Nothing from the tomes of the Eldar, mankind, even what little I could rip from the minds of some orcs, nothing matches the singularities of this spark. Its resistance to the warp is one thing, but if my studying has been correct, it also draws on that very same power as well." "It cancels out the warp and yet empowers it at the same time?" Magnus asked, one eyebrow raised. That made little sense, even for the powers of the warp. "How? You have studied it, how does it do this? What is it that makes that damn girl so special that she can create and control contradicting magical energies as if it were nothing?" "I don't know." Magnus turned away. Of course, asking a demon to explain to him the intricacies of what he is dealing with would produce no fruit. Perhaps I should have hunted her down and captured her for torture instead, taken Lorgar's approach to this. But the Archivist continued. "There are rumors of one who might know." The words struck Magnus like a fusillade of bolter shells. He turned as the Archivist drew forth a small scroll, the demon passing it to the Primarch before continuing. "On a planet far on the eastern fringe resides a creature that knows of the paths between realities. It is said to understand and practice magics beyond even the greatest of sorcerers." "Do you know anything about this creature beyond its location?" Magnus asked. He hesitated, taking the scroll, lest the demon try some foolish attempt at a backstab. Instead, he reached his magic through the summoning circle, preparing to dismiss it and send the creature back to the warp along with its traps. "No. That information has been lost to time," the Archivist replied. "I care not what you end up doing with this information." "We shall see." Magnus tapped the edge of the circle with his blade, breaking the summoning to dismiss the Archivist from the Materium. "Know this, demon, if your information on this source is false, then my vengeance against you will make you wish for a true death. Such is the risk in times like this. Perhaps when all this is done, you will be the one to wish for a release. And with that the demon disappeared, plunging Magnus' study back into darkness save for the light given off by the scroll and the student's flame. Alone once more, Magnus plucked the scroll from the air with his magic, turning it over to ensure the demon had not left a trap for him to discover. Sensing none, he opened the scroll and scanned through its contents, new plans forming in his mind as he read through. The demon was not as helpful as I had hoped, he mused. But perhaps this lead will bear more fruit than I realize. Deep within the bowels of the cruiser, the coffin waited. It has sat undisturbed since the ship passed through the warp, a shrine to heroes lost that none would dare disturb. Aside from one or two of the ship's crew coming to clean the site or pay their respects, it remained largely ignored in the daily bustle of repairs and preparations. But soon, the flame within sensed something. A new energy, unlike anything it had encountered before. The energy seeped downward, twisting around as the spark within the coffin examined it. It was pure, virtuous, everything good that the flame knew of mankind manifest in one tiny spark. That was all the coffin needed. Deep within the bowels of the cruiser, the coffin clicked open. Chapter 3.05, Awakening the Past. Veronica and Ruth had departed hours ago, but Twilight could not sleep. She sat hunched over her desk, mulling over her notes for anything she might have missed. Her notes were organized, thankfully, but the little amounts of information she had gathered did little to make her theorizing any clearer. If only I'd had something set up when Judith manifested her element, Twilight mused, pushing aside one stack as she moved on to another set of notes. Maybe next time, if conditions are right and Matthias would let me, I can set something up to record the results. She sighed, pushing back from her desk as she massaged her forehead. I could keep working on this for weeks, she said. That doesn't sound bad, but time is not on our side. Oh, I wish Princess Celestia was here so I could talk more freely about these problems. A pause, Twilight looking around her room as if expecting an answer. Matthias had spoken to her at length about getting back in touch with Celestia, but with all that had happened. Twilight pushed back from her desk, crossing back to her bed before smoothing some of the sheets out. A small bit of meditation and an attempt at reaching Celestia, perhaps that would calm her mind enough for her to get some sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bed, hands folded in her lap as she closed her eyes and cast her soul into the warp. It drifted about the ship for a moment, checking to make sure there were no adverse developments she had missed, before she reached further to find the familiar light of Celestia's soul among the darkness. She found nothing. Princess Celestia, are you there? She called, putting up a few mental shields to protect herself from curious abominations. Nothing, but Twilight was not one to give up so easily. Princess Celestia, can you hear me? We're lost out here, but I know you're keeping an eye on us all. She stopped, giving a small sigh before continuing. We need you. Please find us. There was no response, but Twilight knew, somehow, Celestia would hear her calls and come to her. That was something she could have faith in. Drawing her soul back would have been the end of it, but as her soul brushed against the hull of the Sanguinium Martyr she felt a disturbance. A sudden flare of unknown energy, deep within the bowels of the wreck. She tried to reach out to it, but it slipped away to nothingness before she could get a good beat on it. She furrowed her brow, reaching out further to see if the source showed up again, but all she got was the normal rhythms of the warp around the ship and the occasional gasp from the Geller field. Something's here, she breathed, opening her eyes as she stood up from her bed. Her armor would take too long to put on, but she grabbed her sword before hurrying out into the hallway. She turned about, trying to think of a plan as she searched for help, her hand tightening around the hilt of her sword as she started off down the hall towards the infirmary. As she ran, Twilight reached out through the ship to try and locate the source of the disturbance. Nothing truly matched what she had felt, but there was still some presence within the vessel that clearly did not belong there. Demons? Aliens? Something worse? Why is the possibility of something worse not worrisome? Twilight rounded the corner, sliding to a stop just outside the infirmary. As she had predicted, Sister Bianca was there tending to the last of the injured, Angelique following quietly behind her. Twilight took a moment to compose herself as best she could before jogging into the infirmary, keeping her sword close to her body so she did not break anything on her way to the hospitaler. Sister Bianca? She called. Tara? Bianca asked, turning to face Twilight fully before continuing. What is wrong? There's something on board the ship, Twilight started, furrowing her brow as she clarified. Something that wasn't here an hour ago. Bianca frowned, her hands tightening as her eyes darted between the patients around her and Twilight. Angelique merely smiled. The head of the drake rises, for the mare and the prodigal shall bathe in its light, she said, drawing a few more glances from around the room. Outside, now, the Hochtaler stepped past Twilight, she and Angelique following close behind. Once they were back in the hall, Bianca turned to Twilight. I can understand your concern, Terra, but please hold your tongue around the others lest you start a panic. Right, Twilight blushed, massaging the back of her head with a free hand. I'm sorry, I understand, and I did not mean to appear harsh, Bianca said quickly. Now tell me, what is it that you sensed? Twilight paused, mulling over the right thing to say before speaking. I was meditating in my room, trying to reach the Empress so she could come and rescue us, but when I drew my powers back I felt an unknown source of energy within the ship. It disappeared before I could get a good read on it, but I think it or something close to it is still on board. I see. Bianca paused, resting her hand on her chin before speaking again. Should you not have alerted Lord Matthias about this? I was going to, but well, given what I've read about things that appear out of the blue on abandoned ships, I figured that if it didn't try to attack us immediately we had a chance to find out what it is and prepare. That's why I came to find you and Angelique. I presume for Angelique's power? The mare longs for the light, but finds the path of the sun long and painful, Angelique said. Twilight gave the other psyker a glance, but made no comment. Well, yes. For better or worse, Angelique's mind is less guarded to the warp than mine, so maybe she might be able to sense residual energies from the disturbance I could have missed, Twilight said, giving Bianca a smile. Don't worry, I'll be here in case anything goes wrong. I do not doubt your skills, Terra, Bianca said, giving a short nod before turning to Angelique. Angelique? Terra felt a disturbance in the ship. Can you find it? The Drake's call comes to the spark, and the light shall blaze against the serpent. Angelique stepped away, lifting her hands as the air about her shimmered. Twilight watched in silence, briefly glancing over to Bianca before Angelique spoke again. Down, where the machines labor in unending lines, the Drake stirs for the mare to come. Magos Errol's forge, Bianca said, stepping forward to rest a hand on Angelique's shoulder. The young psyker dismissed her magic as Bianca continued. I do not agree with going to face this newcomer alone, but waiting for assistance from Lord Matthias and the others might take too long. As long as they meet us in the forge, then we should be covered, Twilight said, stepping past Bianca and Angelique as she started towards the forge. Come on, let's see what this is. You are really taking a lead on this, Bianca said, taking Angelique's hand to guide the psyker after Twilight. Are you well, Terra? I have been too busy with my patients to oversee those tests Matthias has told me about. I'm fine, Twilight said, turning towards Bianca after another pause. Well, fine is probably too strong a word. I'm getting better, I suppose, but well, if I linger too long on one point or another, sometimes I feel like I backslide and start wallowing in pity, or worse, I try to shut everyone out and go it alone. She shook her head and moved onward, holding open a service door for Bianca and Angelique. I don't want to lose anyone again, and for that I have to keep moving forward in some way. I would warn you not to move too fast lest you leave so many behind, Bianca said, pulling Angelique to the side to allow Twilight to move forward. But if Matthias reports are anything to go by, that is a fear I do not think I should worry myself with, Twilight. Twilight froze, her hand tightening around her sword. She turned slowly towards Bianca, the older woman cocking her head to one side. Why use my nickname right now? Twilight asked, praying that would be the end of things. It wasn't. It's your given name, isn't it? Bianca asked, her voice soft. Twilight stammered for a moment before the Hospitaller continued. Matthias told me about the Eldar and what he saw. I thought nothing of it until you helped Angelique before our arrival at Solemnus, and after that it just clicked. Twilight started, her hands quivering. Listen, Bianca, I'm not here to. There's no need to explain it to me, Bianca said, waving Twilight off. Ever since I met you, you have shown yourself to be nothing but a good woman doing her best to save mankind. The Empress thinks highly of you, and far be it for me to challenge her in any manner regarding her trust in others. Bianca stepped forward, resting a hand on Twilight's shoulder. Your secret will be safe with me. Thank why? Unless you do try to do something to harm myself or my charges, in which case I will have to kill you as a Xenos traitor. Twilight swallowed, blinking a few times before Bianca chuckled. Oh dear, I think the other sister's zeal is rubbing off on me. I haven't spoken that way to anyone since I was your age. Yeah, of course, Twilight replied, still not releasing the tension from her hand. See, can we focus on the thing in the forge before we start talking about smiting me? Of course. Lead on. Twilight gave a few quick nods, starting off again as Bianca and Angelique followed close behind. Learning someone else knew her secret was probably the last thing she needed right now, save, perhaps, the ship really being attacked by demons, but at least it appeared her secret was safe. For now. They continued in silence, Twilight checking around corners while Bianca stopped Angelique for the occasional psychic sweep. As the hallways grew darker, Twilight summoned a light in her free hand, purple and white flames casting long shadows across the ship as they ventured forward. Angelique mumbled something, turning away from Bianca as if to start off down another hall, but the Hospitaller was quick to catch her and redirect her to follow Twilight. Soon, they came to the main hall of the forge. It was quiet, with only a low flame burning in the forge, indicating anything had been in here since they broke from the warp. Twilight raised her hand, sending her flame up towards the rafters to provide more light. I kind of expected Magos Errol to be working down here, Twilight said. Matthias has had the forge operate on a limited schedule to conserve power, Bianca explained. Once the main power recyclers are finished, then the Magos will be more active. Oh, Twilight said, searching around the forge for any sign of the disturbance. This is where I sense the source, but it looks like this place has been abandoned for a few hours. The drake will come before the light, and the serpent will strike from the flames. Angelique sang, skipping away from Bianca as she headed towards the forge. Twilight made to go after her, but stopped when she spotted the shrine to Mirchan. And everything that was missing from it. No, she whispered, almost dropping her sword as she rushed to the shrine. No, 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 this isn't happening. Mirchan's weapons and cloak were gone, and the front of the unbound flame appeared to have been wrenched open. Candles that the sisters had burned to consecrate the shrine had been knocked over, but there was no other sign of disturbance. Those bastards. What's wrong? Bianca and Angelique jogged up to Twilight, the Hospitaller gasping when she saw the sight. Dear Empress, why? I don't particularly care why right now, Twilight growled, flames wrapping around the blade of her sword as she continued. Whoever did this couldn't have gone far, and when I do find them I'm going to push them straight into the warp for this. She turned, sweeping her sword to try and find if the culprit had left a track, completely deaf to all that Bianca was saying. A few bits of wax, perhaps a dent in the floor that had not been there yesterday, nothing conclusive at first glance, but Twilight was not one to be easily deterred. Her eyes drifted to another hallway, once leading back up to the rest of the ship. It's moving, she said. I'm not letting it get any further. Twilight, I warned you about rushing into this, now please. Twilight was already off, Angelique following slowly behind her while Bianca sputtered. Twilight, wait. No, I'm not letting that thief get away, Twilight cried, reaching out with her magic once more. She could sense a warmth moving from the forge, like holding her hand close to a flame. The thought that it was like touching the unbound flame passed through her mind, but rage had so blinded Twilight that she instantly shifted her energy to teleport to the source. As she shifted through reality, she spotted a massive figure stopping 5 meters in front of her. The figure wore Mirchan's cloak over its shoulders, but any other details she could not discern in the dark. Twilight brought her sword up, hands trembling as she prepared to face the intruder. Stop! She growled. The figure stopped, shifting about before it turned to face her. Upon seeing the figure in full, Twilight almost dropped her sword. The figure's armor was deep green, etched with faint designs that looked almost like dragon scales. The armor was boxier than most power armor she had seen since arriving in the Imperium, save perhaps some of the more ancient suits she had seen on Terra. The pauldrons were black, save for the right one which had the skull of some ancient beast bolted to it, with gold highlights to make it stand out even in low light. The man himself had coal-black skin and smoldering red eyes, though his gaze softened the instant it fell upon Twilight. So shocked was Twilight by the man that she missed his right hand dropping away from the hilt of a stout warhammer clamped to his belt, though it did not drop the spear of Vulcan clutched in his left. She stammered. Mirchan. Oh, the figure said, his voice deep and soothing. I did not know there were others aboard this wreck. The figure stood up straighter, taking a tentative step towards Twilight. She quickly regained her senses and brought her sword up, a trail of flames rippling through the air. Stay back, she cried, the figure pulling to a stop as she continued. Who are you, and how did you get here? You. The man paused. You do not recognize me, child? I know that I departed in trying times, but I should not have been gone for too long. What do you mean? Who are you? The man hesitated again, eyes darting between Twilight's face and her sword. Finally, he spoke. I am Vulcan, he said. Some would call me Primarch of the Salamanders, Lord of Nocturne, perhaps a few other titles given to me since I last led the armies of man. He frowned, turning away for a moment as Twilight let his words sink in. Though if you have not heard of me, then perhaps I have been asleep for far longer than I anticipated. Not Myrschen, of course. Myrschen is gone be, but Twilight choked, feeling her sword tumble from her hand as she sank to her knees. Vulcan spotted this, taking another step towards Twilight before speaking. Are you all right? I am sorry if my visage has startled you, but I will do my utmost to make sure you are well. Twilight stammered, keeping her eyes down as she did her best to compose herself. The unbound flame had been opened, and the way Myrschen had treated it, the man standing before her must have been inside it. Doesn't help, but maybe I'm sorry, a friend of mine was I thought you were trying to steal. I am truly sorry for startling you, child, Vulcan said, kneeling and resting a hand on Twilight's shoulder. Had circumstances been different, I would have awoken in the presence of you or others so that I might explain myself, but as I thought I had been abandoned here, I acted in the interest of returning to the Imperium and to my father's service. Father? Twilight asked. Just how long has he been gone? The Emperor of Mankind. Surely you must know of him, even if your reverence of him is a bit odd at times. Vulcan drew away, his face lined with concern. But then, if my preparations for the unbound flame were wrong, does the Emperor still rest on Terra? Did the Xenas I thought I killed the beast on Ullanor? Twilight hesitated, which only seemed to worry the Primarch more. Please, tell me Terra still stands. Terra's fine, Twilight started. Wait, what year do you think it is? This is not the 33rd millennium? Vulcan asked. The regenerative processes of the unbound flame can be fickle, but not more than a century or two. If that monster is still threatening the Imperium, I will gladly lay my life down to destroy it for good. It's the 45th millennium. The Primarch stepped back, worry swiftly falling to shock. Twilight wanted to say something to assure the newcomer that everything was under control, but every sentence died before it could leave her mouth. 12,000 years, he muttered. I have slumbered for 12,000 years. Gently Twilight rose to her feet, taking a step towards the Primarch as he stared off into the distance. She had no time to truly close before he turned back to her and swept her up in a tight hug, Twilight letting out a squeak as she was squished into Vulcan's chest. Thank you, child. You have freed me from a greater hell than I could have ever imagined. Sarai propped herself up against the window of the Sword of Redemption, watching the glittering form of Connor before her as the cruiser continued its slow orbit. The Forge world was teeming with activity, as always, with dozens of transports and landers breaking through the smog on their way to orbit. None appeared to give any attention to the inquisitorial cruiser, if they even saw it, and it was this detached observation that Sarai loved to work with. It will be better this way. The last 7 years had been long, in no small part due to trying to maintain as much deniability as possible. With the tensions between the Ultramarines and their factions as heightened as they were, the Inquisition's presence would be an unwelcome one. A few comments to the Mechanicum, some overblown inspections of Iax and Calth, and Sarai would be able to act freely in her search for the student of the Empress and her companions. And, of course, any other sources of corruption that had grown after the schism. Surprisingly, there were many. Lady Olivier? Sarai did not turn as one of the bridge officers approached her. Do you have any further orders? Nothing, at this time, Sarai replied, pushing back from the window and turning to face the man. Have our ground teams reported in yet? There was one communiqué intercepted from some of the parties of interest you have asked us to investigate. The man said, pulling out a data slate before continuing. They appear to come from the Iaxan Governor's Palace, marked for a few members of the Helios family on Calth and Connor. I see. Sarai accepted the data slate from the officer, flipping through it as she scanned for details. The communication was largely fluff, mostly acceptance of an invitation for a party in the coming months, but there were always slight tells, a note on great plans here, a mention of further communication there, all notes that could easily be construed as preparations for something larger. Perhaps the Ultramarines would be thankful enough to allow me to continue my searching, if I turn over a number of traitors to them. Do you think it would be possible to get an invitation to this celebration? Sarai asked, looking up at the officer. It would not be too difficult, Lady Olivier, the officer replied. A few days and some bribes will sort everything out, nothing that should trouble you too much. Please, it's better than stewing on my past sins. Do you have any specific orders? Nothing too flashy, the last thing I need is to draw further attention to myself. Sarai paused, massaging her chin with her hand as she thought. See if entertainment or service positions are full. I expect a potential traitor might be a bit looser around someone they see as beneath them. Lady Olivier. Sarai and the officer turned as another person on the bridge called out. We've detected something that you might be interested in. Sarai blinked, eyes darting between the two before settling on the first officer. Make the arrangements and bring them to my quarters, she said before moving past the officer. She crossed to the second officer, the woman stepping aside from her terminal as the Inquisitor approached. We have detected an unknown energy signature 2 light-years down from Ultramar, the woman said, drawing forth a schematic before continuing. According to our scan, the energies present match no known energy signatures in inquisitorial records. Really? Sarai moved through the schematic, tracing the energy flare and related signatures before continuing. It's too sporadic for a warp exit, and it's too far from anything to be demonic. Have you tried cross-referencing with the other Ordos records? What little we could without drawing too much suspicion, the woman replied. Again, no clear matches. Sarai frowned, looking through the information once more. The readout was too strong to be a mere sensor glitch, but if it did not match any other known signatures, I suppose my sins will be brought to light sooner than I thought. No, not my sins. Sunset Shimmer died a traitor's death, nothing more. Perhaps this is the sign we have been waiting for, Sarai said, stepping back to allow the woman to retake her position. Have any other factions made note of the disturbance? If they have not done anything to capitalize on it, the woman replied, switching to a new screen before continuing. The Astartes have been amassing at Ultramar, sure enough, but their internal politics will keep them occupied for some time. The Mechanicum and the noble houses have their normal jockeying, so we should have free rein for at least a little while longer. That is more than we can hope for. Sarai replied. Set a course. Keep all information channels open in the event that someone else notices the disturbance and goes to investigate. The last thing I want is for us to be caught off guard by some intrusive rogue traitor or a Mechanicum scout. Yes, Lady Olivier. Shall I also put word in to Lord Elias? Sarai hesitated. Elias' presence would be helpful in the event of a confrontation, and perhaps provide someone she could confide in before speaking with Twilight Sparkle, but diverting the Grey Knight and his brothers for a simple reconnaissance and recovery mission would be a larger use of resources than she cared for. No, there is no need for that, she said finally. If the need arises, I will contact Lord Elias myself. Yes, Lady Olivier. With that, Sarai turned to exit the bridge, allowing the shouts from the crew to prepare for warp transit to fade into more background noise. She walked in silence, her hands tucked in front of her as she made her way back to her quarters, her headband pressing into her scalp as she furrowed her brow. The student of the Empress. Twilight Sparkle. The name and the memories of the last night in Canterlot that started this whole mess came welling up in Sarai's mind, clawing at her attention like the demons she had battled since her teens. Pushing it aside with duty or perhaps a chat with one of her equals would be enough to dismiss it if her duty was not fetching the student, and if her equals had not do not fall further down that hole. Sarai shook her head, dropping her hands to her side as she quickened her pace. She was an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, a loyal servant of the Empress. She would do her duty without question, regardless of where that path lead her. Sunset Shimmer would not do that. Finally, she reached her quarters, a larger room near the rear of the ship. Closing the door behind her, she quickly moved to make sure the wards were in place, a number of small runes flickering across the wall. She moved into the center of the room, pushing aside a chair to give herself more space before taking a breath and reaching for her headband. She gently lifted the brass circlet from her forehead, allowing the enchantment to fall away for a brief moment as her power rushed forward and smacked against the rooms, Sarai wincing ever so slightly at the rough shift. She heard nothing, and allowed a small sigh to slip past her lips before she knelt. The wards would hold, perhaps for another hour or so, but soon the voices of those souls around her would return, forcing her once more behind her defenses and away from all the others. 1 hour of normalcy, that is all I need. Master of mankind, hear my prayer, she said, holding her headband before her. I go now to complete the mission you have asked of me, and I will return your student to her rightful place at your side. My prayer is that I shall not fail, for failure will only see your people once more scattered to the stars. Empress Princess Sarai could feel a small tear forming at the edge of her eye, but pressed on regardless. I am sorry, sweet princess, I am so sorry. I hope this makes you proud of me, for once, and I can continue to serve you as your loyal inquisitor. Sunset Shimmer died a traitor's death. I will not fall to the same delusions. Chapter 3.06, Drawing Together. 12,000 years. The words had struck Vulcan like an artillery bombardment. After the young woman, Terra, she called herself, had led him to the nearest mess hall to rest, he had said little as the words had sunk in. 12,000 years. These people were good people, that much he could tell. Terra's kindness was beyond anything he had seen in millennia, and even if her companions were rather confused, they certainly meant well. The Medicae and her psyker companion had gone and brought him a drink, the comically small cup resting in Vulcan's hand as he contemplated what his next steps would be. We are far from the Imperium, with little communication and no knowledge if my father still lives. I cannot lose hope, but this will not end well for many aboard this vessel. He heard a shift from ahead. Vulcan looked up, spotting Terra speaking to a man dressed in black and silver robes. Vulcan could not hear their conversation, but he could easily guess that it was directed at him and the manner of which he had come aboard the ship. Terra seemed to have authority in this situation, for the man made no real effort to interrupt or direct her as their conversation continued. She was truly a fascinating woman. What might her role in all this be, I wonder? Finally the two turned, crossing over to Vulcan as the Primarch did his best to sit up straighter. Terra took a seat across from him while the man found an empty space further down. Is everything okay? Terra asked. I suppose, Vulcan replied. Not military, she appears too loose for such a role. Apologies if I am appearing hesitant. All that has happened has left me with many questions. Just take your time, Terra said, giving Vulcan a smile before shifting towards her companion. This is Matthias. He's the commander of the ship and a member of the Inquisition. He'll be able to help with any questions I might not be able to answer. Vulcan nodded, though if the Inquisition had not shaken the zealotry that had been creeping in last time he spoke with their representatives. No, that is thinking of darker times. If they prove themselves to be trustworthy, their help should not be discounted solely on their beliefs. I suppose my first question is the most pressing on my mind, Vulcan started. What has happened to my father? I presume you mean the Emperor? The Inquisitor asked. Vulcan nodded before the man continued. In the closing years of M.41, an army of traitors broke from the Eye of Terror and lay siege to Terra. The Emperor rose from the Golden Throne to throw back the heretics and ascended to battle the gods of chaos on their own level. M.41, Vulcan repeated. That would be about 5,000 years ago, give or take, no? Then I presume he has acted to restore the Imperium? Well, sort of, Terra continued. The Emperor did not return from the warp until a few years ago, and there was a pause, both Terra and Matthias exchanging awkward glances before looking back to Vulcan. Well, she is the Empress of mankind now. Empress? Vulcan blinked, working his jaw as he tried to make sense of the revelation. I have heard many strange things before, but that is by far the strangest of them all. Do not be offended if I say I do not wholly believe you at this time. If it's a matter of Terra started before catching herself. She chewed her lip, her hand flexing before she spoke again. No, it's all right. You have been gone for some time. Sorry, I didn't mean to sound too harsh. I can see your intentions are in the right place, young Terra, Vulcan replied. As perhaps you have stood in this Empress' presence, you have a better understanding of who she is than I do. Perhaps when we return to civilization, I too might stand before her and see for myself. Therein lies our problem, Matthias replied. Our ship was crippled in battle when we were rescuing you. We have been unable to reach any forces for rescue, friendly or otherwise. And my attempts at contacting the Empress haven't been lucky either, Terra said. This drew a raised eyebrow from Vulcan. You know this Empress personally, then? He asked. Terra fidgeted, looking about as one who had perhaps spoken too much. She's my mentor, she said quietly, looking away for a moment. I understand things were different in your time, but I'm not. Then she is already a better ruler than my father ever was, Vulcan said, drawing surprised looks from the two before him. You are surprised? The Emperor was many things, strong in mind and body, charismatic, all the characteristics of a great leader save for one thing. He did not always make time for the common man, to speak with and help those that were left wanting after his armies had passed through. I always did what I could not stand to see the citizens of the Imperium suffering, but often I felt my concerns fell on deaf ears. Vulcan looked away. To hear that the current regime has taken such measures, even that this Empress has taken a student from among the masses, gives me hope for the future. Oh, Terra started, pursing her lips before continuing. Well then, I'm sure she'd be happy to hear about your observations when we meet. No malice. The girl is just nervous, an odd choice for a student. I look forward to such a meeting, Vulcan replied. Now, what enemy do we face this day? A creature of the warp that calls itself the Dark God, Matthias continued. The forces of chaos are a bit out of my purview, but the Empress has taken action to counter its attacks. As far as you know, though, Vulcan countered, looking to Matthias before continuing. You have said you have not had the chance to contact your Empress, for one reason or another. I do not wish to sound fatalistic, but do you really know what has happened in this new war? We don't, Terra replied, drawing Vulcan's attention back to her. It may be that things have gone bad, and we're too far away to stem the tide before it grows to be too much. But regardless of what we are facing, we are not going to back down. Even if we have to take on the entire galaxy by ourselves, the Imperium and humanity are still worth fighting for. That is admirable. A pause as Vulcan mulled over the girl's words. Maybe the people of the Imperium had fallen more towards zealotry, but there was an earnestness in Terra's words that felt comforting. Very well. If your intention is to save the Imperium, it would be folly of me not to assist you in your endeavors. Oh, good, Terra said quickly, drawing a raised eyebrow from both Vulcan and the Inquisitor. Sorry, I was just expecting you to have some prerequisite to agreeing to help us, like asking to speak to the Empress first or holding us hostage for a month or something. I dread to learn why you would think the latter would occur, Vulcan said. I do not wish to sound rude, but perhaps I may have some time alone? There is quite a lot I must think over to prepare myself for this new world. Take all the time you need, Terra said, giving Vulcan another smile before rising. If you need to talk to anyone, we'll be here for you. Matthias? The Inquisitor nodded, rising and following after Terra as the two departed. Vulcan could hear their conversation drifting away as they disappeared, but he felt no need to listen in on them further. The Imperium had changed, but within its borders there were still those unwilling to leave it for dead. That was something he could work with. Twilight stretched as much as her armor would allow her, the plates clicking together as she rolled her shoulders back. Training sessions had slacked as need for repairs had risen aboard the ship, but Naomi had been insistent on keeping them all in shape for when they returned to the Imperium. It had been the first Twilight had participated in since Mershan's death. It felt good to get back in the swing of things. Terra? Twilight was shaken from her thoughts by Ruth, the sister looking up from where she and the others had been cleaning their weapons. You spoke with Lord Vulcan, yes? Well, not recently, Twilight replied. It had been almost a week since the Primarch had awoken, and for such a great man he was very good at staying out of sight. I don't want to be too intrusive as he settles in. It has been 12,000 years since he ended up in that coffin in the first place. Though it would be nice if he explained how he got in there. Oh, the sister seemed to deflate at that. I had hoped that perhaps you had gleaned some wisdom of older times from him. I mean, that which you have not already learned from the Empress, of course. I saw him briefly just the other day, in the forge, Veronica offered, setting aside her bolter before continuing. I thought it would be rude if I just stared and said nothing, so I introduced myself and asked if there was anything I could bring him. He just thanked me and sent me away, though Veronica furrowed her brow. He seemed apprehensive. You noticed that too? Twilight asked. When Veronica nodded, Twilight continued. When we first met, he seemed more interested in what I had to say rather than what Matthias did. I can kind of understand that since I read up on it later and Vulcan disappeared long before the Ordo Xenos was formed, but it was not like Matthias was being too harsh or questioning. Such instances are usually not instinctive, Naomi said, coming over to inspect her girl's work. I have dealt with many Inquisitors, good and bad, over the course of my life. I have come to see all of them with suspicion unless persuaded otherwise. Perhaps Lord Vulcan has had similar experiences. Well, then perhaps our task can be to show him that he is mistaken in his fear, Judith chirped, her eyes falling to Frederick before her face lit up. Maybe we can show him the elements? Perhaps he knows of them from the past and has some hidden knowledge that can help us in our quest. That's highly unlikely, Twilight countered. Judith paused before giving a shrug of agreement, turning her attention back to Naomi as the Sister Superior finished her inspection. Good work on your drills today, girls, she said. Tomorrow I will see if Lord Matthias will release us for sparring sessions. For now, go store your weapons and then report to Magos Errol for further instructions. Yes, Sister Naomi, the four sisters chorused, turning to leave as Naomi focused on Twilight. Will you be joining us today? She asked. In a little bit, Twilight replied, unclamping her sword from her hip. I wanted to get a few more exercises in, then I was going to try and contact the Empress again. I'll catch up with you after that. I see, Naomi said. There was a pause before the sister spoke again. How are you handling Lord Vulcan's return? Twilight's heart sank, but only just. Yes, it was good that a new Primarch had been found, and Vulcan had spoken well to her and Matthias when they had seen him last. But. I've managed, Twilight said finally, allowing herself to relax. Vulcan will help us, that much I know, but well, I'd be lying if I said that seeing him doesn't make me think of Mershan, and sometimes I wish he'd come back rather than Vulcan. There are times where I wished I had fallen on Moria rather than Canoness Diana, Naomi replied, nodding her head in agreement. This too shall pass, and as Lord Vulcan opens up to you I am sure you can put this unease to rest. I know. A pause before Naomi turned to leave. Come speak with me when you are finished up here, she said as she stepped through the door. Some tea and quiet reflection could do you well, I believe. Twilight nodded, turning away from Naomi as she brought her sword around in front of her. She took a deep breath, sliding into the various stances of Sigismund's treatises as she milled over the discussion she had with the sisters and those she had had with Vulcan. They mean well, but I just don't think Vulcan is ready to integrate that much, she thought, stopping her drill for a moment as another thought came to mind. Or maybe you're the one who isn't ready to move on. Maybe you're just trying to hold everything close to what it was before. Perhaps the thought was harsh, but Twilight knew it would linger until she was back in the company of others again. She continued her drills until she heard footsteps outside. Twilight stopped, turning towards the entrance as she spotted Vulcan standing outside, the Primarch hesitating for a moment before stepping into the training room. Miss Terra, I hope I am not interrupting anything. Oh no, of course not, Twilight said quickly, putting her sword down as she continued. I was just practicing a little, nothing more. A pause as she looked up at Vulcan. Is there anything I can help you with? Perhaps. Vulcan stepped further into the room, crossing to Twilight before continuing. I have seen some of your companions about in the ship. Who are they? Companions? Twilight asked. You mean the sisters? Is that what they call themselves? Vulcan asked. Sorry, but in my time the only sisters I knew of were those whom my father had tasked with bringing in and destroying rogue psychers and the like. These girls seem far more open than what I remember. They're getting better, Twilight said. When I first met them, they were much more reserved around me, as if I was some kind of relic that could be damaged if they spoke too freely or harshly towards me. I see. Vulcan looked away, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for some unseen foe. Twilight frowned before she spoke again. Is there something wrong with them? She asked. I notice that you've been a bit standoffish when it comes to some of the things around here. You have a sharp eye, Terra, Vulcan said, shifting so he was now seated before her, Twilight taking a seat of her own as he continued. When I last walked among mortals, I had seen signs that the Imperium was forgetting itself. Fact was falling to myth, reason falling to zealotry. To see that it has taken more root than I could have possibly imagined is rather distressing. They mean well, Vulcan, Twilight said, resting her hand on one of the Primarch's knee pads. Yes, it can be confusing and frustrating at times, but their faith in the Empress and the Imperium has led them to do great things. I am sure. The Primarch sighed. I suppose it is old melancholy rising up. The Imperium has moved further afield than I can remember, and I wonder if I still have a place in all this, that I am still needed. I think so, Twilight said, offering a small smile. I did not mention this, but a number of your fellow Primarchs have returned as well. Oh? Who? Korax was the first, and the Lion followed after him. They've had their own trials, but I like to think they've grown into their roles again. The Lion? Vulcan asked, looking away for a moment before continuing. Johnson was rather obstinate, so I cannot imagine the hassle it must have taken to keep him under control. That's why I was so worried about bringing you in, Twilight continued. He threatened to kill an entire fleet's worth of soldiers if we couldn't convince him the Empress was who she said she was. That does seem to be his manner of dealing with such problems. Vulcan replied. From what little you have told me, your Empress continues to intrigue me. There was a pause before Vulcan looked back to Twilight. Miss Terra, when you first saw me you mentioned a name, Meerschain. Twilight's expression dropped, but not enough that her composure broke completely. I didn't think you heard me. I hear many things, though perhaps my hearing is not as sharp as the Khan's or Korax's. Vulcan replied. Meerschain. That is an old name from Nocturne. I presume he was one of my sons? Yes, Twilight answered. Meerschain came with us when we went to find your coffin. He was my friend, a good man who listened to what I said and came to my aid when I was in crisis. Twilight choked, trying to push past the image of the demon striking Meerschain as she looked to Vulcan. He was killed just before we escaped. I see, Vulcan said, his voice soft. I am truly sorry for your loss. Thank you. It really means a lot to me. Twilight looked down before continuing. I'm not from a violent or harsh world, and sometimes I've been caught off guard by how cruel this galaxy can be. Having someone who was there to help me and comfort me during my time here, well, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if it weren't for him. It is good to hear at least some things have not changed, Vulcan said, giving a short nod as he continued. I did my best to teach my sons humility, never to take for granted where they had come from and who they stood to defend. If we lose that, can we even call ourselves human? Meerschain said much the same when I first met him. I'm glad there are others out there that hold those beliefs. There was a pause, Twilight looking up to Vulcan as the Primarch mulled over her words. When it seemed he did not have much more to say, Twilight rose to her feet. I have other duties to attend to, but if you would like we can talk more later. Before you leave, Miss Terra, Vulcan said. Might I have a closer look at your armor? Oh, of course. Twilight stepped towards Vulcan, offering her arm as the Primarch inspected the armor. He ran his hand across the metal, eyes darting across minute imperfections that not even Twilight could see. It is quite beautiful workmanship, he mused, releasing Twilight's arm before continuing. I can definitely see some of my father's handiwork in the weave. Your tale of this Empress being the Emperor reborn carries more weight with each passing day. I see. Another pause, Vulcan looking away from Twilight before he too rose to face her. If your duties permit you, and if it would not be too much of a bother, would you mind if I inspected your armor more closely? Perhaps there are some modifications I can make in. Thanks for your rescue. Oh, Twilight drew back, brushing her hand across her arm. I don't want you to feel obligated for anything. Please, I insist. You have done me a great service already, it is only fitting that I repay the favor. Twilight hesitated again, her eyes darting between her armor and the Primarch. The chances that she would need it for active combat were slim, but it was still a comforting presence that she could not give up so easily. But if it would help him settle in more. Well, okay, Twilight answered, giving a short nod as she continued. Okay. Bring your armor down to the forge when you are able, Vulcan said, giving Twilight a quick smile. I will need some time and a chance to talk to your friend to get the tools I may need, but I promise you I will provide you with a gift worthy of the kindness you have shown me. Twilight nodded, turning to leave before Vulcan spoke. And Terra? Yes? She asked, turning back to Vulcan. Thank you once more, for showing me that hope still remains in this galaxy. All preparations are set? Matthias asked. He could have sworn the monitor in the communications alcove had started to wear down from the number of times he had leaned against it, but exhaustion forced worries of cosmetic wear away from his mind. Final preparations have been completed, Lord Velos, Magos Errol spoke through the Vox. I have directed the machine spirit to ensure that additional power is in place should our initial inputs be insufficient. Good. Matthias massaged his face, taking a deep breath as he watched the monitor. Empress, we have tested this many times, please, let this come through. Open comms and activate the distress beacon. There was a pause, a burst of static following as Errol temporarily broke contact. The pause lengthened to a minute, and Matthias was prepared to hail the Magos once more before they got a response. One single ping, followed by an echo. Thank you. Magos Errol, Matthias said, allowing a smile to break across his face. I have a response. The distress beacon is activated. Confirmed. The machine spirit is following available paths, though its signal is weak. I will explore to see if there are other routes that may be open to allow for a stronger signal. I will leave you to your work, then, Matthias said, backing up from the monitor before continuing. Bring me a full diagnostic when you are finished, and let me know how best I can deploy personnel for your assistance. Errol did not reply, but his silence was answer enough. The distress beacon would reach further, and perhaps soon they could reach a passing ship or nearby star system and get some help and hopefully not draw attention from any of the Imperium's enemies. At least the Empress has blessed us with one step forward. Matthias was prepared to leave when he received another hail, this time from the command bridge. Lord Velos, the voice called through. We are detecting signatures indicating warp exit. What? Have our enemies found us? Matthias quickly crossed to the monitor, keying in a command to give him a view of the outside. Do we have visual yet? Negative. Available sensors will need more time to wait, visual spotted. Transmitting you the information now. There was a pause before the screen changed. The image was scratchy, but there was no denying Matthias' vision as a strike cruiser and escorts broke from warp space, the ships moving up before coming to a stop. Can you get a better image? He asked, trying to adjust to better identify the vessel. Negative, Lord Velos. The ships appear to be holding position, and at this range there is only so much our sensors can do. If they intend to attack us, they will be able to get ideal firing positions without us being able to respond. Then let's hope they don't realize we're still alive, if battle is what they seek. Matthias mulled over his options. Calling the crew to battle stations would prepare them for an attack, but it would also give the newcomers ample warning that the Sanguinium Martyrs was still active. And give them all the more reason to stay back and bombard us from afar. My lord, the vessels appear to be hailing us. The bridge said. They are identifying themselves as strike cruiser Sword of Redemption, Ordo Malleus. They wish to speak to you. Demon hunters, Matthias breathed, his hands tightening. They must have been drawn by our warp exit. A pause, Matthias trying to release some of the tension in his hands to no avail. At least they haven't fired on us yet. Perhaps the Empress still smiles on us this day. Very well. Open comms, I shall speak to them. Another pause, the grainy image of the ships replaced by the grainy image of a woman. This is Lady Inquisitor Olivier of the Ordo Malleus, she said, her voice choppy from static. Not only was it the Ordo Malleus, but a Lady Inquisitor as well. What forces are around here that someone that high-ranking had to respond? Identify yourself, vessel. This is the Sanguinium Martyrs, Matthias Velas of the Ordo Xenos responding. Matthias replied, keeping his voice even. I am afraid you have come at a most inconvenient time, Lady Olivier. We must always rise up to the task presented to us, regardless of the circumstances, Lady Olivier replied. What brought you to this? Our ship was caught between Xenos and heretical forces. Our warp engines were damaged, among other equipment, and we have been stranded out here for the better part of a month. I see. Hesitation. There was more the Inquisitor was not telling him. No matter. Fortunately, your deliverance is at hand. The Empress herself tasked me with locating your vessel, and her student above all else. Matthias said nothing, allowing the Lady Inquisitor to continue speaking. Is the student Terra still alive? Lady Terra is alive. There was a lengthy pause. Through the static Matthias could not pick out much, but the Lady Inquisitor's hesitation was intriguing. Resentment at the assignment? Unlikely, perhaps something more personal. Believe me, Lord Velas, I would like to trust you in this matter, Lady Olivier said. But I need assurances that she is well. When I have those assurances, I will be able to help you and your fellows fully. I would call her up to speak with you through comms, Matthias offered. But from your tone I gather that won't be enough to satiate your concerns. Not in these times. Send a shuttle to my ship, I would like to speak with the student myself and ensure she is well. Trap. As the Empress has entrusted her to me during our mission, I cannot release her into your care at this time. Unfortunately, you are not in any position to bargain with me, Lord Velas. Lady Olivier replied. I did not come here to fight, my friend, I was sent by the Empress and I truly do wish for us to work together in our endeavors, but you must understand that precautions must be made when a ship thought lost suddenly reappears in the middle of space. And you must understand that I cannot allow anything to befall the student while she is under my care, Matthias countered. There was a lengthy pause before he continued. I will be with her when you speak to her. If you attempt to cause her any harm, you won't be able to escape me. It will not come to that. I will make arrangements for your arrival. With that the communication closed out, leaving Matthias alone. While the Ordo Malleus had not stepped in to try and take Terra by force, their insistence on speaking to her directly could only lead to more conflict. And then there's whatever Lady Olivier isn't telling me about her mission. Bridge, he said. Have a transport prepped for launch, and have Terra, the sisters, and the Valhallans meet me there for briefing. End of chapter 3.06, Drawing Together.